Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Alien Familiar podcast. I am Clayton.
I am Beth.
I am Hayley.
I am KD.
I'm Jordan.
I'm Tripp.
And today we are going to be kind of following up on a topic that we kind of discussed in our very first episode about introductions. Today we're going to be talking about what to expect in a first game, giving advice for game masters on how to run a first game, how to introduce people into the hobby by playing that first game, things that first game should have in it, and just general advice on how to provide teachable moments in the game for new players. So I guess I'll start off and this is going to assume that you already know what genre you're going to be playing, that you have a good idea of just what your players want in a game, how to do a first session, and you guys are meeting at presumably somebody's house, and everybody is showing up. You've already got character sheets printed out, any other materials like pencils and dice and everything else that you need. Most of the following that I'm about to say is the stuff that I do for a first session, regardless of the system, or rather, whenever I have players who are new to a particular system. It isn't necessarily players who are brand new to role-playing games. This is what I do whenever I introduce players to Apocalyptia for the first time, or Savage Worlds, or Dungeons & Dragons. What I typically do at the very start is I have all the character sheets out, I have handouts for the players giving a brief summation of the rules. I like to be able to express what the core rules of the game are. For instance, in Dungeons & Dragons, you want to roll a d20, and then there are modifiers on your sheet. In Savage Worlds, talk about how there is the wild die that you roll with every single ability that you roll. In Apocalyptia, all you need is a d6. You roll the d6. If it's a 1, you re-roll it again to see if you roll one again and it's a botch. If it's a 6, you keep rolling. So those are the types of things I like to go over initially. And then from there, just walk people through character creation. Try to keep everybody on the same step of character creation. Try not to let people get too far ahead. That way, if there are any questions, it is relevant to everybody who is sitting around the table. Does anybody else have anything that they want to say is something that they try to have, or if you're a brand new player to a game or a system, that you like to have the game master give you whenever you start out a game?
Something I find really helpful is discussing the world at large and then the world that we're specifically playing in. So, for example, we're on the podcast, we're getting ready to play an Eclipse Phase game. The book went right over my head because I'm an idiot. But talking to everybody else, finding things that they found interesting in the world, and then specifically talking to the DM, KP, about tell me everything this world has to offer, and then tell us where we're focusing on, really helps me get into character, create a character, figure out what other people are playing, figuring out how this first session's gonna go. And I think it's an important conversation to have with your players as a DM and as a player, to ask questions about where you're going to be. If it's a first session, is the whole thing going to be taking place in a small town, or are you on the move? Are you discovering this world? A lot of that comes into how the campaign's going to overarch. And knowing the world before you even play your first session can be really helpful when creating a good campaign.
Well, I also think it helps with character creation.
Yeah.
For example, if you're, playing a campaign that's set largely in an aquatic world, you're going to want to have your character have some skills in boating or swim. However, if it's, an urban metropolis that spans most of the globe, yeah, those skills might be there, but it's not going to be super relevant. So I definitely think it helps for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And on the topic of character creation, as a game master and you're running this game, I feel like it's really helpful to, sort of earlier in the week, if you both have time, take someone that's a close friend, a significant other, I don't know, a battle sibling, whatever your relation with them might be, and sort of make a character with them first. So that way, when you come into the larger group, you have someone that can help divvy up that task. Because I know, having run a lot of games for larger groups, it's very taxing on the game master to sort of help everyone at once make characters. So it's usually good to sort of divvy that burden up, and it helps, someone else get a better understanding of the system too if they're, helping other people make characters.
I also think it's really helpful to be given like a book or a short story or a movie that helps to explain the world or the type of characters that are in it, like something that you can look at for inspiration. And for really new players, that can be especially helpful, because then you could maybe even take one of those characters and tweak it a little and use it as a character in the game.
Mm-hmm. I think that if the game master is new to the system, it is imperative that the game master go through and make a character before anybody else. As part of your prep for the game, is you go through and create a character that maybe you can use it later as an NPC, but just to get the experience of knowing exactly what character creation is like. And I definitely like your idea of having somebody else in the group kind of go through it ahead of time so that they know and they can help out. Because if you've got 5 players and the game master is definitely going to be taxed during character creation, because their attention is going to be so divided, jumping back and forth between answering different people's questions, even if you're all on the same step of character creation. For instance, like in Dungeons and Dragons, say everybody is on the step where everybody is deciding what class they want to play. Well, suddenly that game master, everybody's on the same step, but the game master is explaining sometimes 11 or more different classes to everybody and trying to remember, okay, this person's wanting to play a wizard. What do I need to remember to have them do during character creation because they're playing a wizard? And the ranger as well. The ranger is a completely different play style. Having somebody else there to kind of walk people through that.
I would almost say, too, I think, if you can, obviously, this is a hobby that's very time dependent, and, most people have either school or work or whatever they're doing in their life to stay busy and make a living, that you need to sort of work around that. But if possible, I almost feel like the best case scenario is sit down one-on-one with the game master and make a character, especially if you're both new or, the player has never even touched an RPG before. Because I know for me as a game master, I feel like character creation is unfortunately one of my least favorite parts of running a game. I don't know how true that is for everyone else that's
I disagree.
Games.
I love games because when you're creating a character, I get to fall in love with them for the first time. And then I'm a new DM, so I got to make several of the new characters with my new players, and having that one-on-one session with them, being able to give my full attention to helping them customize the best character helps me fall in love with them to make sure they have a good story to play with, that they have agency. And I find that to be really, really helpful as a player and as a new DM.
I have also loved having a DM sit down with me to start a one-on-one session.
Yeah.
I was joining this Dark Heresy 40k campaign partway through, and the others had already, blown a spaceship out of the sky, and the GM and I had our own little session, and I had my intro session where I got off on my own kooky adventures, and then I joined the group. So I already had an idea of who I was playing, got the chance to go through those skills and figure out what they meant before I joined a campaign already in progress. And that was awesome. But again, I know not everyone has the time to individually meet with their players. It's quite a commitment.
But if you don't have the time as a player or as a DM, I think having a group where you can share info. I know Clayton has all of these amazing documents, and whenever he's like, hey guys, you should read up on this, or here's something, there's several RPG books depending on the world you're in. If you have the time, read them, or at least share the PDF with your group for people who can. So for example, if you have those 12 classes of Ranger, Fighter, whatever, you can read up on them. You could go on forums, you could read them, and doing research beforehand, so you already know what's been done, what hasn't been done, what can be done.
This can also be terrifying. Like that time Clayton posted a gif of a drone with armor-piercing rounds and said, guess what's showing up in Apocalyptia? And everyone was like, well.
Yeah, that was terrifying.
But I agree. I think that it's a good source of sharing information.
Yeah, keep in touch with each other. You're playing a game, but you're also friends, hopefully. It's good to share your dank memes with your players.
I think the what can be done part is probably the most important thing to introduce somebody who is brand new to role-playing. I've talked to a lot of people who've never played a role-playing game or got them into the very first game they've ever been in. And for one thing, it's hard to kind of wrap your head around it because it's such a strange thing that doesn't have a very strong analog to any other social behavior that we have. When people are just kind of dropped into this sandbox world and told you can do anything, it's instant analysis paralysis. And if you can, like you were saying, show what your class or, your profession, whatever kind of thing, whatever you're supposed to do, whatever your niche is, like it gives them some kind of orientation, and even beyond what their character can do, how things work at the table, as far as like the negotiation of the narrative between everybody involved, and the power balancing that happens even outside of the dice, but just the way that people communicate their ideas and how that gets hashed out to become the concrete consensus storyline of what has occurred. All that apparatus, that meta rule kind of thing that happens is very weird to new people to this hobby.
Jordan, that was kind of a perfect segue that you did all by yourself there for what the next thing I wanted to talk about, and that's like
what go, Jordan.
That's like what new players often play as their first characters. You mentioned the analysis paralysis, just having everything thrown at you and not knowing what to do. I have seen that lead to a very particular first encounter in role-playing games where the player is incredulous to, I can do anything. Yeah, right. Let me prove you wrong by me trying to do this completely off-the-wall, insane thing. Let me try to kill the very first person I see, whether or not they are a non-player character or a player character, and see if this is true that I can really do anything in this game.
Like a little kid testing their boundaries, basically.
Exactly.
I think that's really important because saying that you have all of the freedom is completely true. However, me with my whole one-session experience as a DM, I found that sitting down with the people, talking about the world, having them meet the other players, so they already know, like, okay, I can do anything in this world. I can do anything with my character. However, this is what these people are doing. This is what they're already doing. Where can I fit in? Where can I add to the story? Where can I add to the world? So yeah, you could run off and kill the first person you see, but how would that benefit the story? And I tend to try and find people who are like-minded like me in the fact that they really like interesting plots. They love to read. Those are the kind of people I like to try and play with. At least I've had luck with. I know it's really chance that you're going to run into someone who wants to play a murder hobo on their first RPG out. But I think it's the gambit that you run with introducing new players to a world, as long as setting that you can do anything in this world. Here are some things that people could do, and you could do whatever you want, but also understand that you're making a character. You're not making choices. You're not making choices. You're making a character who makes choices. It's not you. It's the character. And I know that's really hard to get into at first, but talking to the other players, seeing other things, like in the Eclipse phase, I've been reading other characters that they have for character examples. That's really helpful. Just see, like, okay, so this is kind of what the world's going for.
I was going to say, the other jump that I think people have to make is to realizing that it's an act of collaborative storytelling.
Yeah.
Instead of, like, most RPGs, video games, and things that you play, it's just you making decisions that affect your own story. And if everybody goes into a tabletop role-playing game thinking, this is my goal and it's not changing no matter what happens, I think that's a recipe for disaster most of the time.
At Apocalyptia Factions game much?
I think establishing a strong narrative book in the first session for a GM is imperative for this sort of first-time experience, because that will hopefully, and in most scenarios, disable the murder hobo function that people just seem to switch on sometimes, because hopefully that narrative hook will make players be like, oh, I want to know what's going on here, or this is like if it's like an amnesia story arc where they're like, I don't know what my background is. That could make me a murder hobo. I could have just been a murder hobo. I don't know, but instead it should be like, wow, I should go to the tavern, or I should just ask this first person I see anything. Sort of just hook the players in so that hopefully they won't have to feel they need to test that, oh, I can do anything, well, I'll prove it to you if I can, sort of mentality.
I know for a fact we have at least one person listening to us who has never played a game before, who is interested in it. Cool. And I know we've thrown around some terms that somebody who is absolutely brand new to the hobby would not know, such as murder hobo. Does somebody want to explain what that means?
So a murder hobo is a slang. It's one of my favorite words.
For every Hayley character ever.
Wow, actually no.
That's not true.
It's not
the
true.
Exact opposite, really.
Yeah. So a murder hobo is a character who is probably most likely part of an adventuring party. So they travel around a lot, and regardless of story or plot, they will do, I could steal from them, I'm gonna steal from them, I'm gonna kill them, I'm gonna kill them. Oh, but you don't have to rob them, you don't have to kill them, I'm gonna do it anyway, because I can do whatever I want. It's powering through a campaign with force, disregarding storyline.
Senseless acts of violence.
Yeah, I've dealt with a few murder hobos in my time. I've actually met, like, a real-life murder hobo. It was really terrifying. Yeah, they were a terrible person. They, like, went out of their way to ruin a cooperative game because they were gonna have fun destroying everything. My first game I ever played with, we had a character who was a dragonborn bard who was a murder hobo, where they'd go ahead of the party, switch sides, and then go in the opposite direction. They'd kill all of our informats that we were supposed to talk to, and then the rest of the party would catch up to them, and everything would be dead, and we couldn't do anything. So it's somebody running off.
Yeah, a dragonborn bard.
A dragonborn bard who's a murder hobo.
At that point, I feel the rest of the group needs to come together and say, we're gonna kill this person.
We did. We slaughtered them.
Okay.
It took like 12 sessions, but we finally were able to kill them. It's great. We blamed it on a dragon. They got sat on by a dragon.
If you're playing a game for the first time, though, especially for a brand new player and you see this tendency, this is the time to have what is in my profession is called a teachable moment. You explain, like, yes, you theoretically can do anything, but there are consequences of your actions. Mm-hmm. There are natural consequences, such as if you walk up to the first person you see walking down the street and stab them, you're going to have the cops called on you. There's going to be a manhunt. You're going to get arrested. Or if you put up a fight when the police come to arrest you, you're probably going to get killed.
You might find out that man at the crossroads that you stabbed was your father, and like a few years down the line, you'll be stabbing out your eyes because you've been sleeping with your mother. Oedipus comes back. I don't reference Oedipus in every conversation I have, just so
I was going to say, Tripp, I feel like it's been coming up a little bit more often.
It's Oedipus on the brain.
Not to mention the interpersonal consequences of a murder hobo. Usually, that's going to really just ruin a game for everybody else. Unless, again, I in the sort of the best and the worst episode, I brought up that evil game I was in where we all sat down with the GM and each other and said, okay, we're going to play a bunch of murder hobos. That's what we're going to do.
Good.
That's a completely different scenario. But when you have someone trying to tell a story and people trying to, help shape that story, running around killing people for no real reasons, kind of a dick move. Let's be real.
And it might seem like it would be actually productive. Like, I played with someone who was a new player who we were going to go infiltrate this cult party, as you do. And she goes, okay, I'm killing the major domo and stealing their outfit. And we're like, A, we're not at the party yet. B, you think that might be a little not subtle? But it seemed like it's an approach. It's a tactic. So it's just a matter of balancing when that tactic is going to be in character and create interesting consequences, or when you need to rein it in a little bit. Yeah. Figure out other possible options.
Just like taking a temperature of the room. Like having the players be like, hey, that's an interesting idea. What about all these other things? And just like helping a first player and not guide them in a sense of railroading their story and railroading their character. That's very important to not do. However, if you see someone going down a murder hobo path, present other options and choices so they can creatively add to the party and the story without taking away their voice of opportunity.
Yeah, I think typically that kind of thing happens when a new player is bored or disoriented and doesn't really know what else to do. Like you were talking about, you don't know we're not at the party yet, and they don't really know where they're at. Because again, like the whole consensus imaginary world is hard to keep up with for new players. But I think that there's some pretty solid history on good game design techniques in video games and whatever else about how to take a new player. You play the first stage of any video game, and it's all about like teaching you what to do and how to do it. And something like that in a first session of a role-playing game, I think, is really helpful, given just a microcosm of what the rest of the game is going to be about, and letting people figure out how their characters' particular rules work and everything. I think that would keep people, on the track that you want them to be on.
And that's like what KP is talking about doing with the upcoming Eclipse phase, which will be our next actual play, is having all of our characters come together and do a small job so that we get comfortable around each other, since we're supposed to be people that have known each other for a while, and to also get comfortable with the gameplay before we jump into like the main job that's the main campaign. So that can be a good way to do that.
There was a question that sort of filtered into my mind over this topic of conversation, largely that when new players come in, and we've talked about this in other episodes as well, they tend to usually base the character off of A, themselves, or B, an archetype, or C, a character from another media. Mm-hmm. And something I've kind of noticed that tends to happen sometimes with newer players is they will not go full murder hobo, but depending on the person, they may seem to say, okay, well, if I were in so-and-so game and I was in this situation, and I had a villain that was asking to be spared, maybe there's a compelling in-character reason for it, or maybe he has information we need. But I know that I would just cut that man down for his sins, or, some other sort of anti-hero kind of vigilante reasoning. As to the people that have run games or encountered those characters, do you feel as though that's something where the GM should sort of sit down with the player and talk things through, or do you feel that's a sort of that they're playing their character that way? What do you guys think?
Well, if it's something that their character would do, and honestly, like, if that's their character, I mean, I wouldn't stop them. I think realizing a character and also growing as a character, so like, yeah, they might do it, but the other players might try and stop them.
Yes.
That's an interesting dynamic. That's something that brings up character growth or party dissonance that could add to your story rather than break it. However, if it got to the point where it's impeding the rest of the players, the character... So the game that I'm running is actually a sequel game of a different sequel game of a character's. The DM had this character that they brought in who was actually a murder hobo, who their character was like very militant, and they were in the middle of peace negotiations at the end of their campaign, and he's like, okay, and I blow everyone up. And he got kicked out of that game. And having that kind of character, so while he stayed true to the character and the character story ended, it kind of derailed that campaign, and that got messed up. But it really helped creating a different set of worlds. So if you're having a character that's maligned in the sense of might disrupt the party or disrupt the story, that's something that you have to feel out. And if it ever crosses a line, talking to them and say, hey, this is a great character, maybe for something else. I think it's important to have those conversations.
As a general rule, when a player says, my character is going to try to do something, I never say, no, you can't try to do that. But in your situation of having the bad guy on his knees and the player says, okay, my character is going to kill this guy, I might take a few moments to remind the player of what the consequences in the world of that might be. For instance, is that character a paladin who is held to a higher standard, who is not supposed to just go killing an enemy after they have surrendered? I would explain what that consequence in the game would be. In this instance, the paladin would lose all of their paladin powers. If it's the rogue of the party who is wanting to do that, maybe remind them of how the law might feel about that, and if they're going to be hunted down as a murderer for doing that.
Or maybe their thieves guild discourages killing.
Right.
I also think it's legitimate to use the game system to guide a player's behavior. Like most games, I think every game I've ever seen probably has something along the lines of wisdom or willpower or something like that, where it's not an easy thing for a human to commit cold-blooded murder. Make a roll and make it some really high difficulty to bring yourself to just kill this person who's sitting there begging for their life or whatever. Like, make it a struggle. Just because they theoretically can say I do whatever doesn't mean that it's as easy as that.
That's really smart.
I love the use of in-character leverage as well.
Yeah.
I have a character in a campaign that's always at odds with another character, and we kind of keep each other in check. I'm not quite as heretical as I might be, and she kills less innocent passerby in the name of the Imperium. It's fine. So, you gotta use checks and balances among characters, especially if you know that you can lean on more experienced players who kind of can guide without quarterbacking, or taking too much charge of the game and controlling other players' actions. I mean by that, having a conversation if it gets to that, and using, like Jordan said, the game mechanics.
I think there's at least 2 other troubling tendencies that are worth talking about in brand new players that I'd like for us to discuss. And one of those is a lot of people do this. They just show up and they're just spectators. They don't really know how to interact. They don't know when it's their turn to interact or what they're capable of, but what they're actually able to do when that comes around. That's probably harder to deal with than any of the others. The second one I was thinking of is the person that shows up and wants to just dominate the spotlight the whole time. Also really difficult because you've just brought a new player into a game that you want them to play, and then you're saying don't play it quite as much as you are. So, I don't know. Just wanted to throw that out there to see what you guys thought about those 2
Your first is the term that we've been kind of throwing around in previous episodes, the edgelord or lone wolf type of character. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of new players, especially people who are themselves shy coming into a game. Mm-hmm. Their first character will be this lone wolf,
leans on walls.
Yeah.
Very standoffish.
Yeah. Think Wolverine in the X-Men. They're the kind of guy who they don't believe in the group. They're always doing the opposite of what their commander says. If they're doing anything, they're just going to stand back and just look menacing in the corner. That's their whole shtick.
The group only holds me down.
Yeah.
Ultimately, they could have a character that's written to be incredibly social and involved and has lots of skills, but they're not as comfortable in the group dynamic to step up and use them. Mm-hmm. So, have to be lured out.
Yeah.
Or given the
luring
chance.
them would be really helpful. And I think for both scenarios that you talked about, giving them cooperative opportunities. Mm-hmm. So, for example, involving them, say, hey, somebody approaches you with another person in the party, and so that way you have another player to interact with, but you also have an NPC that you can interact with. And that triangle of sociability might help. With a lone wolf character, an edgelord, and a character who always wants to be in a spotlight. The way that you can do that is, okay, give them that spotlight, but broaden it to highlight everybody else. So, yes, they're still getting the attention that they want, but also this character, and that character, and that character. They're all involved. And then hopefully they'll realize it's not them, it's a team, it's a party, it's a group.
I think you touched on a really fair point there, Hayley, in that, especially with the spotlight character, tying them to either NPCs or other PCs is a very helpful way to sort of not tell them, hey, don't be as involved, but sort of have their sort of hyper involvement bring in everyone else sort of on their shoulders. Because I think on one hand, it's super great that someone that's a new player wants to come in and play a face or some sort of, I hate to say protagonist, but something along those lines. For the edgelord and the, what was the other term we were using? The lone wolf.
Lone wolf.
I feel like, and this is probably a little controversial, but you just gotta break them down. I feel and not like in a mean way or, you lord your GM-ship over them, but give them an NPC to care about. Give them maybe an animal companion to sort of slowly start to reintegrate them into the larger group over time.
Edgelords love
because they're not gonna they're not going to come in by themselves. You as the GM sort of have to usher them in, and hey, then they get a real cool story arc of how this sort of lone wolf character found, his heart deep down and his or her heart, and now sort of accepts the group as a whole.
Can be hot.
True, in a weird way, actually.
Do you think that you should define face?
A face character is someone who is very social in and out of, well, maybe not necessarily out of the game, but definitely in the game. They're the one that talks to the other NPCs and extras, usually is the character with the most charisma, and is there to sort of, be diplomatic and smooth things over. If the group gets in trouble, they're the one there to talk them out of prison. That sort of role. Hayley, essentially.
It's me. I always play face characters, and I guess it's kind of like my first RPG instinct. Instead of rather doing the lone wolf, I'm someone who's like, okay, well, how can I add my actual skills to this thing? So it's like, I'll just talk forever and never stop.
But yeah, I feel like you sort of need to, in both cases, integrate other people in. Again, and I'm not saying you pull the God card, because that's just an asshole thing to do. But sort of nudge that character in the right direction, start to give them some things, maybe even talk to them outside of the game, and don't bring up the party. Be like, what would you like your character subplot to be? What is in your background you'd like to see come up? And then maybe tie that to the party, and sort of maneuver the lone wolf into sort of becoming a pack wolf.
To go back to the example of Wolverine, using both comics and movies, as
fancy.
In the comics, Kitty Pryde was the member of the X-Men who kind of got Wolverine to kind of be a part of the group, and then it passed to Jubilee once Kitty Pryde got too old. Once she left her teenage years, it kind of shifted to Jubilee. In the movies, it was Rogue. And then in the most recent Logan movie, it was X-23. Those are the characters kind of bringing the lone wolf into a bigger group.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you just need a teenage girl to... Never mind.
All right.
A younger, seemingly vulnerable character who's probably not, because she's actually a badass, to get someone who doesn't care about anything to care about a social dynamic.
That is the easiest way to get those edgelord male characters. Give them a little sister or something, because that'll just, as gross as and weird as it may be, that they're role playing something out there, and that'll really just get them to care, and hopefully in a genuine familial way.
I know I, as a traditionally extremely shy person, tend to play kind of a twist on the edgelord, where I'm still kind of acting standoffish and super cautious about everything, but I kind of figure out who is leader in the group, and I just do whatever they say. And I'm thinking the whole time, please God, don't put me in any sort of a spotlight situation, because I can't deal. And one thing, I'm going to ask you, Clayton, what kind of things you think help draw that particular kind of person out. Mm-hmm. But one thing that has definitely helped me is that Clayton told me that when you're really shy, it's super helpful to play a couple of asshole characters. As long as you let people know that's what you're doing and everybody's on board with you being an asshole. And I've done one of them so far, and it seems like that's really good advice. What other kinds of ideas do you have?
To be completely honest with you on your Abena character, I talked to Jordan about it before we even began playing. Kind of asked him, hey, your character has kind of had this backstory. Would you help me to include this other player into the group? In other groups that I've been in, whenever I've been a player, I've kind of taken on that role whenever a new player comes in. Having somebody else who you trust at the table who is a player, make it their job to make sure that other player is not or is included in things. Because really putting more work into the hands of the game master is... The game master is already overloaded. The game master is already thinking of everything else that is going on in the game. It's just one more thing to remember. Hey, I have to make sure that I include this other player in the things that I do. I'm not saying game master should ignore that. That should be the focus for the game master to do that for every single person at the table. But if there's a particular player there who needs that little bit of extra attention, make sure that some other player has the responsibility of giving them that attention.
I have been asked to be that guy. To be like, all right, make sure Clara feels she can be included. And I'm like, oh, okay.
I think that's actually a really interesting point. I know a couple years back I joined into a ongoing pirate game based off the anime One Piece. And the game had been going on for about 2 months before I joined in. It was with a sort of established friend group that I was kind of friends with, but slowly becoming closer friends with. And it helped that while I played a lot of games, I hadn't played a lot of games with these people. So the GM sort of said, okay, well, you're on this pirate ship. Maybe you should just, like, be the captain's number two guy, you know? So there was one of the other player characters was the captain. I just started calling him boss and just doing what he said, and it worked to integrate myself into both the group overall and the game. So I think that's a really good strategy.
My response to Clayton with that, as far as like structuring the game, since it's a military game, was to give you a good deal of authority and responsibility, so that it wasn't just, all right, you're the scout, run off in the woods by yourself and see what's going on, but instead you're over all these troops. You know, you've got to, like, whatever you are saying carries a great deal of weight because half the damn army is under your command, and it would force a group, you know, war council kind of discussion among everybody. Like, I didn't have to do that with, like, Hayley, because I know Hayley's not going to have any problem, you know, speaking her mind on a given thing. But if people were empowered with a great deal of narrative weight with their decisions, I think that pulls people in, because a lot of really introverted people that I've seen try to get into role-playing games, when I talk to them about why they're so quiet at the table, it's often something like, well, I just don't feel like anything I'm going to do matters. Everybody else is going to be doing something, and I'm one of 6 people, and so, you know, I may as well just sit and watch, something like that. So
maybe these people know more about the universe or
Right.
the world, and their actions have more weight than mine do.
My problem is I'm not the fastest thinker. Like, a lot of times by the time I've gotten to the thing I want to do, we're like a scene or two ahead, and I'm like, crap, that would have been good to come up with back then. And then I've got to, like, catch up. But that's really, I think it worked out really well that you put me as, like, the Master of Arrows or whatever it is I am, because it was exactly the opposite of what I wanted to happen. I was basically telling Clayton, I'm like, just put me somewhere where I can just, like, be quiet and kind of be sort of half spectate. And then this whole thing came out, and I was like, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. But I think it's really helped a lot. I think it's something you just have to jump in with both feet and just make yourself do it.
So now I kind of want to go into that first game. Everybody's made their characters. Like, in the very session where everybody made characters, I want to try to have enough time at the end that we can do a quick scene where everybody plays their character and something happens. And typically in this scene, I'm going to use Dungeons & Dragons as an example. I intentionally follow genre tropes for a brand new group or a brand new, just a brand new game in a genre. That way people have a good frame of reference for what is going to happen, what they can do. In Dungeons & Dragons, if I'm introducing new people to the game, damn it, the game is going to start in a tavern. There is going to be a stranger whose face is obscured by a hood sitting in the corner smoking a pipe. And just when I've told the players what's going on and asked them what they're doing, whenever they're all sitting around just kind of awkwardly looking at each other and kind of mumbling like, oh, I'm going to go up to the bar and I'm going to order a drink, that's when I have either a fight breakout in the bar from 2 disgruntled patrons, or bad guys show up and burst into the bar and start causing mayhem. I like to give a reason to get right into the game. In media res is what I try to... Actually, I believe the term is in media res. I think that's...
It's RES, but I don't know how you
I think the
pronounce it.
correct
Well, if
pronunciation
it's
is
Raz and
rage.
Grosh, then it's probably
Grosh.
Raish.
say both, edit out the wrong one.
Yeah, editing.
So I try to have that fight, and during that fight, I want to tap a broad range of what the game offers. I want to, like, give them the opportunity, like, not just the players the opportunity. I want to have non-player characters doing things as an example of what they might potentially be able to do, like pick up a chair and bash someone over the head with it, try to trip someone, try to disarm someone, just so that they can get a good grasp really quickly of what is possible in this game. if I have bad guys running into the tavern with swords, one of them will leap up onto the bar, kick some whiskey over, and drop a torch in it. And then when the players want to do that, before they even roll, I will explain all of the rules that I have that are associated with that. So that they know even before they roll if this is a good idea to do at this time. And more often than not, I kind of fudge the numbers a little bit so that it is a good idea at the time, mechanically within the system.
Sort of along those lines, I like to do sort of a 3-step process to really get the game off running. I also like to do that a short little bit after the character creation. But it's almost entirely RP, sort of role-playing, and the characters would very rarely interact with each other. It's more, maybe there's an NPC, or maybe they're talking to me as the game master in character. Maybe like they're telling a story at a bar, for example. But it sort of lets the players find their feet as the character, establish some personalities, quirks, whatever they might have, and sort of get that basis that they're going to ultimately, I feel like, need to go further. Then the next session is just almost entirely combat, especially if it's a new group. And that's because combat usually takes a while in a normal game, but especially with new players and a new group, it's going to definitely take a lot longer. So now they have their personality of their characters, they've seen what they can do in combat, and like you said, you sort of explained the ins and outs of it. And now they've also, for whatever reason, been forced to fight together. So they have this sort of bond, even though some of them may not have talked to each other in character yet. And so then when you get to the final step there, that is that sort of party immersion, maybe they can talk about how they fought in the last one, and you can sort of develop your rapport based off that. You already know how your character maybe feels about certain things because you got that limited RP session. So that's usually my goal when I try to ease people into it. It takes a little bit longer, but it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it just burned down your first starting city in your first ever game, and you go, thanks, guys. I really enjoyed that. Can't wait for the next session.
Oh, I had blueprints.
That tears up your GM notes. That's what I try to do.
There's kind of a neurochemical recipe for how to get people hooked on games or whatever else, and mobile apps have mastered this more than anything else, but it's all about having a bunch of early, easy successes, and then thereafter increasing the challenge regularly and making successes much more unpredictable. And if the first couple of sessions are designed in that way, that at first, you're a badass, you're just knocking out all these nobodies, and then you start running into a couple of tougher guys, and then, suddenly it's not so certain, and it's not a predictable thing. That's the key. If you throw a series of challenges that are reasonable, but from the subjective perspective of the player, outcome being uncertain, that's how you're gonna have people walking away saying, I had a great time. It's just dopamine triggering, man. That's all it is.
Science rules.
Kind of building off that, like where I said I explained the modifiers to them. What I used to do with a brand new player was I would say, don't worry about the numbers on your sheet. You just roll your dice, and then I'll tell you if you succeed or not. I have come to realize that is a terrible way to introduce a person to the game. You need to teach them the game. That's why they're there. That's if they're wanting to play this game, they're wanting to learn this game. So telling them, explaining how the modifiers work, that's going to get them engaged, because that gives them power, because they know how things work. When people know how things work, they're more likely to do it.
So having a firm grasp and understanding of the basics as early on as possible is usually the best core thing.
Yeah, good game systems will have that fundamental core mechanic that is then elaborated on in incremental ways over time. But yeah, I agree with you, Clayton. You don't want to put them in a puppet show to start with, and they're just like, oh, great, I'm participating, kind of. No.
So we've kind of gone over how to introduce a new player to the game, and this is kind of assuming that the game master knows what in the hell they're doing. I kind of want to go into somebody brand new as a game master. Maybe they have played in a game before, but now they're stepping into the game master role. I want to go over some advice on what to do and some things not to do before your very first session as a game master. We'll have Hayley talk in a little bit, but I want to regale my very first game mastering experience, because even though it happened 20 years ago, it is burned into my mind. A couple of things that I want to tell everyone not to do. And these are things that I have never heard on a podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts about role-playing games. I've never heard this exact advice before, and I feel it's incredibly important, because if I had heard it, I would have had a much better time. So, before the game, I had a big meal. Do not do this. I'm a shy guy, and I had a pretty sizable meal before the first time I game mastered. And about half an hour into the game, I had to excuse myself really quickly, and I was not going to be able to make it to the bathroom in time, so I ended up stepping outside in order to vomit into some bushes because my nerves were so tied up and bad. And then I wiped my mouth clean, and I went back in.
Just got back in there.
As if nothing had happened. About 15 minutes later, I had to excuse myself again and went out and dry heaved in the bushes a little bit more.
Oh, no.
So, my advice is the first time you game master, do not eat a big meal.
Those bushes were really just the foundation for what you've become today.
I'm curious.
It's a worthy sacrifice.
How much of this was your own nerves and how much of it was the group? Was this a particularly difficult group?
Vomit-inducing group.
No, this group was my best friends at the time.
Oh,
it was
man.
Two of my best friends, his older brother and his older brother, or his sister-in-law. I hung out with these people every weekend.
Yeah. I don't know how Clayton and I survived socially at all those days, because the two of us together were just a little huddled mass. In the rain, we were so, shy about everything.
So, before we get to Hayley, does anybody else want to share kind of if they have any memories of their first game mastering, like what it was like?
For me, it was way too long ago. I was a little kid. I remember I was running a fragments of a game module. It wasn't one that I had in front of me. It was just stuff that I wrote down notes from. But that made it a lot easier. I would definitely recommend to anybody pick up a well-reviewed module and read it ahead of time and know what you're getting into, because learning to improvise comes later.
For me, it was a lot of attempting to coax people to talk, I remember. And I touched on this as well in earlier episodes, but my first group was two people who are a lot like me. They never shut up, and essentially dominated the conversation. And then I think three other players whom, as I mentioned before, also did some text RP online, but rarely talked out of, when we were just hanging out as friends, not in a role-playing setting, much less as a character in a world. So that first session was a lot of me trying to just coax people to talk and get things out there, while also attempting to rein in the two people that were like me and who were off just trying to burn things down. And one had a vendetta against orcs. So I remember that first session, just to sort of test the waters with him, I had an orc bartender, to which he immediately just tried to stab this guy in the forehead with a broken bottle. And I was over there just like, all right, we are 20 minutes into this game. I'm ready. This is probably my own fault. But it was a lot of, it was a lot of fun. I still look back on that campaign pretty fondly, mostly fondly. Advice-wise, I would definitely say, for that first session at least, come in with a detailed plan. Because even if you don't use it, you don't want to be, unless you're just really good at improvisation, that's a great skill to have in real life as well. But you don't want to be in a situation where you don't know what to do, and you're like, I wish I should have planned for this. So even if you don't end up using that plan, having a couple pages worth of notes for that first session and maybe the second one, always a good idea. Also, don't try to force anything, that testing the waters there that I did. I thought that was a really, I was patting myself on the back. I'm like, oh man, character conflict. In reality, I shouldn't have been surprised that this first-time player who made it quite clear he had a vendetta against orcs was gonna go try to stab this bar owner. That was something I should have seen coming, and probably, rather than tempt him, I guess, should have waited to see how it panned out. I guess my advice in that situation is literally do not get too full of yourself, because that was something I did a lot in that campaign, and that ultimately, I'll be honest, and this sucks, the campaign boiled down to me trying to rein in those two very vocal characters who eventually just became full-on evil to spite me. And so I was, having these armies of paladins out trying to stop them, and it really was not... I mean, again, people had fun overall in that game, but eventually you could tell there was this, GM versus the two players thing that, looking back, is not something anyone should have to deal with.
Okay, so I play a lot of RPGs. I play too many, some would say. However, I have recently decided that I'm going to attempt to be a DM. I've been playing in this game. It's an old World of Darkness Vampire the Masquerade game for roughly about a year. The DM, who I love dear and truly to my heart, graduated and is now moving away. And I loved this game so much, I said, I'm going to step up and I'm going to run a short story. So for the first few months, I've been planning what I'm going to do, and I had my first session last Sunday. I'm in a special kind of hell where it went amazingly well. It wasn't supposed to go well. I planned, this is going to be terrible, but it's going to be fun. And what I did is I have 2 players who are from the original campaign, and I have 2 new players who are just entering. So what I did is I had one-on-one sessions with both of my 2 new players to give them agency in the world. They interacted with several characters that are going to be key to here, and I also gave them information that the other characters didn't, so when they finally met up, they'd have to work together and piece together the story of what they knew. That was really great. Everybody got in. They loved the world. I didn't have anybody distracted. Everyone was really focused and excited about this story. And then afterwards, I asked them, tell me one thing that they learned and one thing that they want to do in this campaign. And that was really helpful for me to, figure out what to do. The game went really well. Immediately afterwards, I went home. All my players had already posted summaries of the first session and were drawing fan art. They're already drawing art, and I'm awesome. Wow, this wasn't supposed to be good, friends. Stop telling me I'm good at things. My ego can't handle it. I'm very selfish.
If it gets any bigger, the house will explode.
So, that went really well. One of my concerns is I came in with a lot of story and 0 math. So a lot of the times it was, okay, we're gonna do damage. How do I do that, my friends? And we'd work together, so it was a lot of co-DMing when it came to damage rolls. However, one of the things that I think was really great that I didn't plan on but ended up happening is one of our characters had this really great character moment where they grew as a character. Vampires in Vampire the Masquerade, one of their biggest weaknesses is fire. They have to roll to not be rot-shreked, which is just straight up fear and just leave everything and everyone behind to get away from fire. I had a character spend all of their willpower for that session to stay inside a burning house to try and save memoriam of their friends that they think are dead. And I did not plan on having such a touching moment. I planned everybody leaving and running and all the evidence is burned. But I made them role play this thing. I made them roll to see how many items they can save. I made them roll to see if they could avoid debris. I did everything by the books. And it was just such a touching moment to see someone try so hard and care so much about the story and these characters I've created for them to explore with. So I had an amazing first time as a DM. My fear, however, is tonight's my second session. And if my first session was amazing, there's nowhere else to go.
But nowhere else to go but up, you mean?
Oh.
Hopefully. I actually got really lucky. Tripp, who's across the table from me, is going to come in and play my antagonist. So I can focus on getting my story together while they are going to be helping me set up some propaganda. It'll be a lot of fun. So, that's been really helpful in hearing you guys talk about things to do and things not to do. I will not be eating a big meal before. Now I know. But yeah, that's how my game's going. Thanks for asking.
Personally, I'm just planning on eating a huge meal and then just vomiting all over the game.
Nothing establishes being an antagonist as much as vomiting all over the other players.
Exactly.
Well, you just be vomiting blood because you're going to be a vampire.
And I'm gonna do method acting for this.
Real
okay, well,
Daniel
bring out your
Day-Lewis
suit.
Over here.
Kadir.
Don't worry about it.
Be like, I got a touch of the consumption.
But in a charming way.
Hayley, can you give some sort of estimation as to how much time you put into preparing for that session?
Well,
Howdy.
put so much time. I took roughly about 3 weeks where I just read all of my books, came up with my stories. I wrote every single character. I statted them out. They have like little bios and everything. Then I spent another week just figuring out the mystery of everything. So I've actually, the mystery is the character that I played in the campaign and her terrorist boyfriend who ran away to burn down the patriarchy, as you do. They got into some shit and they are now currently missing in the headquarters of the Camarilla, which is their main enemy. And I'm having all of the players come in and have to deal with enemy territory to try and find their friends before it's too late. Bum, bum, bum! And what I did to help myself is I took these characters and I played them figuring things out. So I had my own little mini session. And then I was like, okay, now I know everything. And then I, info-walled out my story. It was like, okay, if I connect this and this and this and this, then I have 5 sessions to tell this story. So I put too much work.
So you said 3 weeks.
I did 3 weeks.
And
How
Jordan
many
was
hours?
over there.
How many hours would you guesstimate?
That's really hard because whenever I was not sitting down and working on it for around 2 or 3 hours, I'd be at work at my sewing machine. I was like, okay, so we're in New York. What do I know about New York? How many blocks is it going to take to go to this thing and that thing? So, all of my time is my answer, but roughly around 6 hours, maybe a day. I got really into it, you guys.
Jesus Christ.
I really like
So
my
that's
story.
not preparation, that's obsession, but
If you used more than 5% of that work in the actual session, I will eat Clayton's hat.
I'm not even kidding you. I got pictures. I edited pictures
She
for my
has
players.
slideshows.
I have slideshows. I wrote out text and I got images and I shared it with my players and they were so excited that I put so much work into this and it all worked out really well.
Haley, is there any way we can get a actual estimation of how much work you did in? Because I'm holding Jordan to this.
She said 6 hours a day, and from what I remember, 6 hours a day for 3 weeks, and from what I remember from the way I used to prep, yeah, I believe that.
How much did you use?
I used roughly 80% of it.
No.
I did.
There is not enough time in a session.
Yeah.
Do you want to see my slides? Because I have them with me right now. You can see my fucking slides.
No, there is no way that you used that much information.
All of my information was set up. So I have
for the
all of my
future.
things set up for the future. So 80% of my
So no, you didn't use all of that stuff in the first session. Because it's all set up for stuff that's going to happen later.
Okay. I misunderstood the question. I was able to take all my information and perfectly set them up for them to discover 80% of my plan.
Jordan, you were
So, yeah.
someday.
So, how much of the information that you prepared got directly used in that first session?
4%, maybe.
Yes, I believe that.
Clayton, your hat is safe for now.
I am look at me. I am the DM now.
I think that's interesting because I remember for that first game I had, it was, back when I was a student, so it was over spring break. It was a Lovecraftian game too, so there was some horror elements. I'd just be sitting around, listening to horror music, thinking of god ideas and subplots and all this other stuff that I haven't done in a long time, even when I do run a game. So that first game is kind of a treat for you as a GM because unless you hold on to that sort of strict. I could very well be an outlier in that I, stopped doing so much prep work for when I run a game. But
No, that is how you have to be a game master or else you get burnt out. You have to learn how much actual effort is required to present the information that's going to be given in the game that you're going to run. If you spent that much time
on every game,
yeah, you would not be in the hobby anymore because you couldn't stand it. It is worse than a job.
Yeah, that's the big trick for new DMs is manipulating, tricking your players into writing the story for you, and then you just sit back and be a referee. That's
red card, no murder hobos allowed.
We should have those. Yellow cards and red cards.
But yeah, I think that it's fun really just tearing into that sort of new world that you're coming up with and putting in all those session plans and looking at characters and being like, I want this to happen to them, and I want this plot to happen for this person, and, you know.
Well, it was really helpful to have my players tell me what they wanted. I have one of my new characters, they were really, really interested in figuring out the story and the mystery of what's going on. And then I had another character who's like, my character's really punchy, it got her in a lot of trouble. I would like to have some sort of character growth that makes her able to use words instead of her fists. And I'm like, that's really interesting. Cool. I really am excited about that. I had another character who's like, I'm in New York and I know the traffic's terrible. I want to like drive a lot of things and fuck up the traffic system. And I was like, that can be arranged very easily. Just drive on the sidewalk, kill everybody. It's fine. So having my players tell me what they want is really helpful for me planning in the future. Because I put so much work into the first session and almost zero work into my session tonight. So,
well, you're already learning that's how it works.
That's how it goes. So just being in touch with my players, making sure that they're happy with the story, and having that, not like I'm the DM, you're the player, and that's it, but having, be able to like cross the lines. Like, okay, this is a game that I want everybody to really love. So what do you want? What is something you want to explore? Something with your characters, or the world, or just something you think would be fun is really helpful.
And if you got, you know, a pretty good idea what your storyline is for your game, and you got 3, 4, 5, you know, fairly well fleshed out NPCs, you can pretty much sit back and just play those characters when appropriate and feed storyline to the group that way, rather than have these elaborate situations planned out and maps drawn and all that kind of stuff. It's much easier to just take the role of character in your game that the group or a player will encounter and just tell them what it's like from the perspective of someone that is living in this imaginary world. You know, it feels more organic that way anyway.
Something that also just popped into my head, I'm not sure why what you said triggered it, Jordan, but there's nothing wrong at all for your first time jamming, opening up a campaign guide and just playing it from the book. Nothing wrong with that at all. If anything, you know, that then kind of whets your appetite to venture out on your own and do things, you know, your own style. Like, that'll really just, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's a good way to learn and helps with everything. And by the end of it, I imagine, I know this happened with someone that did that for me. By the end of it, they were starting to sort of improvise anyway. They were like, I don't really think, I think I could do this bit in the book better. And so it's just a good way to ease into it.
Yeah, one of the things that is helpful for me is that I'm not nearly as creative as I think I am. So I went through the book and I found these stock characters that were already invented in this world, and I tweaked them to my own usage. So that way I know that they're in this world and I have them at my disposal, but I don't have to use them. So reading through the book, figuring things like what you have, where you can like add things on, take things away, it's really helpful. So you're not putting all of your creative efforts into building every single aspect of it. You could focus on the story, or on a character, or on a mission. I think that's really helpful.
So what I'm thinking about is when I was first trying to GM when I was like 12 or 13, and I tried to run directly from a module, and I had, you know, sorry if any of y'all are listening to this podcast, but I had a very difficult group of players who absolutely refused to pick up any sort of plot hooks that I set down for them. If I told them there was, you know, if there was, of course, because it was a module, there was a signpost in the middle of town that had like different ads put up, and one of them was like offering this gigantic monetary reward for going into some dungeon and slaying some monster. And they were like, what else is on the poll, you know? And it was like, and so like, what do you do in that situation when you have you have no experience, you're running a module, you have no improvisational skills because you haven't had the chance to, you know, cultivate them yet? Like, do you have any kind of tricks for that situation?
The only advice I would give in that particular situation, and this would be very difficult for a 12-year-old girl to do with her father and her her sister's husband, and that would be level with them and say, guys, I am brand new to this. I wrote this game so that we can play it. This is the game that I have. Do you want to play it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's part of the player social contract. You know, you're there to play a game. And the alternative, if you're more experienced at running games and can improvise a little bit, if you're running like a D&D kind of game, make it fairly realistic to what it was like to live in medieval Europe. It's like, yeah, okay, other people have work. You want to go shovel shit out of the barn? Like, let's go work in the fields all day. That'll be a fun job. Or you can go on this adventure.
Give them really lame options to make them take yours.
Serfdom or an adventure. Your choice.
That's not a bad idea. To it's a way of giving them options, but as well as this is the obvious best choice. Mm-hmm. So it also helps the world. I know I've been using that word a lot in this thing, but I think it really is important. So yeah, when you're doing a fantasy thing, if you want to make it close to medieval times, it also helps the player ground themselves okay, I kind of know what this is. I've seen a few movies. I've read a few history books back in middle school about this. And it also helps the DM solidify things that they can and can't do in this world. So I think that's really wise.
Another piece of advice is if you are a player and you know somebody is game mastering for the first time, do whatever you can to help them out. But if you have one of those asshole players who decide, I'm gonna take advantage of the fact that this person is a new game master, they don't know, they're not good at improv, so I'm going to cause havoc. I went through this situation and I told the other player, who was a good friend of mine at the time, listen, it has been a while since you have been a game master for the first time. You don't remember what it was like. You need to give this guy some slack. It's been my experience that players who have been in the game for a while, they come to expect a certain amount of improvisation from a game master, especially if they've had the same game master for a long time, and that game master has kind of grown with the group. Whenever a new game master comes in, somebody needs to remind the players that, hey, you need to remember what it was like when we very first started playing, how tough it was on the game master, because the game master is the toughest job at the table. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you need to remind players that you need to respect the fact that it takes so much time and effort, and it is a gift that the game master is giving you whenever they run a game. And if you don't want to accept that gift, you need to get out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's very true. There is a line, though, that shouldn't be crossed in that regard, where the game master really just becomes too full of themselves that, this is my gift, and if you're not accepting it the way I want to accept it, well, fuck you. And I think in that case, that's when, everyone needs to pull themselves out of the game, sit down, look at the game master, be like, yes, you're giving this gift to us, but if we weren't here, you'd just be some asshole sitting behind a desk holding a present, and I'm not trying to directly contradict you, but I think that there's two sides to that for sure.
Balance.
Yeah, it's just been my experience that my experience happens a lot more than the experience you just described. But it definitely does happen.
I just think back to that first game I ran where I was that asshole with the gift. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's why I'm a little bit more partial to it. Where I just remember there was a point in which I sought out someone else I knew that was in another role-playing game, but in the same circles as me, and invited them to my game on the condition that they play a paladin to keep those two players I talked about earlier in line. I was just so my head was honestly up my own ass, if you excuse the language, which no one does because we swear all the time around here.
This has the
fuck
explicit.
You is fine.
Yes,
good.
Fuck yous are fine. This has the explicit tag. We're covered.
And so, I think back to me doing that, and I just sort of realized that there are definitely two sides to that. I wasn't giving my players enough slack, and they decided they weren't right in their way of just saying, well, we're going to try to ruin your game by being 100% evil. But I think that's just sort of the balance you have to strike.
Yeah, so. It's important to remember that the DM-player relationship is not an adversarial one, because that's what a lot of... Because, I came into, attempting to DM when I was a kid from a board game called Hero Quest, where you definitely it definitely was set up where the DM knows everything, the players know nothing, and you're kind of trying to kill the players off. So that was my misunderstanding coming from that it was supposed to be an adversarial situation. And so I think that's probably really common.
Well, what I think is important to know is that you're playing adversaries, but you're not supposed to be adversarial. You're supposed to give them a challenge that they may or may not overcome, but at least make it fun. So while you are playing the bad guys, does not make you bad guy.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're playing adversaries, but you yourself are not an adversary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
should
important.
Be
And sometimes you help.
sort of impartial, I feel like. You should, not only are you playing the enemies that are trying to kill them, but you're also playing their closest friend or some other sort of role that's much more friendly. Mm-hmm. You know, and in my experience, unfortunately, like, it got to a point where it felt like first and foremost I was just playing, like, vigilantes out for hunting for people, or, like, army guys, or, like, you know, guards, and you don't want to get into that dynamic with your players. Mm-hmm. Because while that game finished, and, you know, I'm actually still relatively good friends with both of those people that I was having that sort of engagement with, you know, it almost broke the friendship at the time, and the game, at multiple points, did not seem like it would finish, just because of how split the party became, and, you know, all these other issues. So you really just gotta try to remain as impartial as you can. Even if you feel like your story's not being respected, you should definitely talk to those players and say, hey, there wouldn't be a game without me. Like, we need to have sort of a middle ground here. Like, yes, you are helping make the game possible, but, you know, to sort of counter my asshole sitting at the desk with a present, without me, you're just a bunch of people sitting around twiddling your thumbs, being like, all right, well, what do we do now? Gotta find that just sought-after middle ground.
I've seen this work a few times for new DMs. If you can get a DM who's experienced to co-DM with you and run the enemies and, like, be a reference for rules and stuff like that while you sit and, you know, tell the narrative, do the role-playing, all that kind of thing, and just outsource the number crunchiness and also the role of direct adversary to an experienced DM or player. That's worked out pretty well on a few different games that I've played in. It gives somebody a chance to tell the story they want to tell and not freak out over what page whatever table's on and so forth.
Grapple rules.
Yeah,
that's the true
rules.
hell.
Thanks, Tripp, in advance.
You got it, dude.
Well, guys, what you say we stop this bullshit and start rolling some dice?
Yeah.
You mean tear paper?
This has been a production of Alien Familiar Media. You can find past episodes and more at alienfamiliar.com. You can email us at alienfamiliarmedia@gmail.com. This production is protected under a Creative Commons Attribution No Derivatives license. Music for this episode is Suburban Outlaw by Forget the Whale and can be found at freemusicarchive.org.